The heat came for Western Europe first. Spain, France, Germany, all of them baking beneath a vast dome of superheated air, their temperatures soaring past 40 degrees Celsius, their records tumbling one after another. But heat domes do not stay still. And now, this one is on the move, sliding relentlessly eastward, dragging its great wall of punishing heat across Italy and Hungary, and on into the Balkans, where villages are already being evacuated ahead of the racing flames. And as it travels, it is pressing down on the parts of Europe that are, in many crucial ways, the very least able to withstand it. This is the story of a heat wave expanding east, where exactly it is heading next, why the eastern half of the continent is so uniquely vulnerable to it, and whether the summer of 2026 is genuinely on track to become the single hottest that Europe has ever recorded. Before we go any further, if this is exactly the kind of story you came here for, take just 1 second to subscribe. A lot of folks watch these all the way to the end and simply forget to, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Alright, let's begin. First, a very quick word on what this thing actually is, for anyone who has not been following it closely. What has been baking Europe all summer long is what meteorologists call a heat dome, a giant sprawling zone of high pressure, trapped and locked into place by a stuck, buckled jet stream high in the atmosphere. Under that dome, the air is forced to sink, and as it sinks, it is compressed and heated, while the clear, cloudless skies let the sun bake the ground relentlessly, day after day. The heat is sealed in place, like a lid clamped tightly over a pot, with no weather systems able to move through and break it up, and so it simply builds and builds and builds. But here is the single most important thing for our story today. These domes do not sit in one spot forever. As the great atmospheric pattern slowly evolves and shifts, the core of that high pressure drifts across the map, and this particular one is drifting east. Forecasters have been tracking the ridge sliding steadily across the continent, dragging its 40-degree heat away from Western Germany and the Benelux countries and hauling it toward Italy, Hungary, and the northern Balkans, all of it reinforced by an exceptionally hot, dry air mass being pumped straight up from the Sahara Desert. So the heat that flattened the west has not gone anywhere. It is migrating. And the east is next in line. And there is a deeper reason the eastern interior of Europe is so prone to baking, one written into its very geography. The western edge of the continent, Britain, France, Portugal, sits right up against the vast Atlantic Ocean, and that sea acts as a giant natural moderator, its cool waters taking the edge off the summer heat and softening the extremes. But as you travel east, away from that ocean influence and deep into the heart of the continental landmass, the climate itself changes character. It becomes what geographers call continental, with far greater swings between the seasons, colder winters, and hotter, more intense summers, because land heats up and cools down far faster than water ever does. And much of Central and Eastern Europe sits within a series of great low-lying plains and basins, like the broad Pannonian Basin around Hungary, ringed by mountains, landscapes that can act almost like a bowl, trapping and pulling the hot air within them. So when a dome of Saharan heat finally rolls into this region, it lands on a place that is already primed, by its very nature, to cook. And here is something that genuinely surprises a great many people. When Europe sets its most extreme and ferocious heat records, they very often happen not in the west at all, but in the southeast. The all-time temperature records for the entire continent have been set in places like the island of Sicily, in the south of Italy, and in Greece, and in Cyprus, the eastern Mediterranean. The city of Athens has hit 46 degrees Celsius, parts of Cyprus have climbed toward 47, and southern Italy once recorded very nearly 48 degrees, among the single hottest temperatures ever reliably measured anywhere on the continent. This is a region that sits much closer to the searing hot air of North Africa and the Middle East. And so when a powerful heat dome parks itself over the southeast, or drifts into it from the west, the temperatures there can climb to genuinely, dangerously ferocious extremes. And this eastward march of the heat is not some new or unusual phenomenon. It is a pattern Europe has seen play out many times before. Cast your mind back to the great heat wave of 2007, for instance. It began by settling over Italy and Turkey, and then, over the following days, it expanded, pushing eastward into Greece and all of its neighboring countries, and reaching, in the end, all the way to Hungary and Ukraine. Greece bore the absolute brunt of it, with the temperature in Athens soaring to a blistering 46 degrees. Over 500 people died in Hungary alone, and the total cost of that single heat wave was estimated at around 2 billion euros. It was a textbook example of precisely what we are watching unfold all over again this summer. A dome of heat, born in the west and the south, steadily and relentlessly rolling east across the continent and hammering the southeastern nations hardest of all. And I'm genuinely curious as we go, where are you watching from, and is the heat reaching you this summer? Let me know down in the comments. I read them all, and honestly, they often decide what I dig into next. And this is exactly where the story takes its most important turn. Because the eastern half of Europe, and most especially the Balkans and Southeastern Europe, has to face this brutal heat with far, far fewer defenses than the wealthy nations of the West. This is a region made up of countries like Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Bosnia, North Macedonia, Albania, and their neighbors, nations that are, on the whole, considerably less wealthy than a France or a Germany, and which tend to have older infrastructure, much tighter public budgets, and simply far less money available to spend on the expensive business of adapting to a hotter and more dangerous world. And so, summer after summer, when the heat finally rolls in over these countries, the strain shows almost immediately and dramatically. Nations trigger their very highest emergency heat alerts, the so-called red codes. Power consumption spikes to record breaking levels, as everyone who possibly can switches on a fan or an air conditioner, placing enormous stress on electrical grids that were already stretched thin to begin with. Emergency services find themselves completely inundated with calls. And, most tellingly of all, these countries very often simply cannot fight the resulting disasters entirely on their own. In recent heat waves, nations like North Macedonia have been forced to formally request international assistance, with convoys of firefighting crews from Serbia and Croatia and Slovenia all rushing across the borders in urgent, coordinated efforts to help battle the flames. In fact, just 2 summers ago, Southeastern Europe endured what was described at the time as its hottest summer in a full 130 years, the entire region trapped, for weeks on end, beneath a suffocating mass of subtropical air dragged up from Africa and the Mediterranean, bringing with it relentless heat, deepening drought, and widespread destructive fire. And there is a quieter tragedy hidden within all of this too, one that is very easy to miss, because the true human cost of these eastern heat waves is often even harder to see than in the West. Many of these countries have older, more rural populations, with a great many elderly people living alone in villages, far from hospitals and from help. Their health systems are frequently more stretched and underfunded, and critically, many simply do not have the detailed systems needed to accurately count heat deaths in the way that wealthier nations increasingly do. Which means that when the heat kills here, and it does, quietly, through failing hearts and overwhelmed bodies, a great many of those deaths may never be formally recorded as heat deaths at all. The real toll across the East is very likely far higher than the official numbers will ever manage to capture. It is a catastrophe that unfolds, in large part, entirely out of sight. And that brings us squarely to the disaster that more than any other single thing has come to define the Eastern heat: fire. Quick one before we continue. If someone in your family or a friend would find this genuinely useful, especially anyone with travel plans in the region this summer, please do send it their way. That word of mouth is honestly how a channel like this one grows, and if it's been worth your time so far, a quick like really does help the next person find it too. Nowhere on the continent is this clearer or more painful than in Greece. Greece now sits right at the very front line of Europe's entire wildfire crisis, and almost every single summer now, as the heat steadily builds through July and August, the country begins to burn. This very summer, as the heat has intensified and the dome has pushed eastward, a wave of new wildfires has broken out across Greece, forcing the emergency evacuation of village after village as walls of flame race through the tinder dry hills and forests. And Greece, tragically, is very far from being alone in this. All across the wider Mediterranean and the Western Balkans, from Italy to Croatia and beyond, the deadly combination of extreme, prolonged heat, bone-dry vegetation, and strong, gusting, dry winds has created what forecasters chillingly describe as explosive wildfire conditions, the kind of conditions where a single stray spark can erupt into a vast, unstoppable inferno within a matter of minutes. Thousands upon thousands of hectares of forest and farmland have already burned across the region this season. Whole communities have been ordered to abandon their homes and flee, and the extreme danger is forecast to continue right through August as the parked heat dome keeps the entire region dried out and primed, waiting only for a spark. And there is a cruel twist to these eastern wildfires because they so often strike in the middle of the peak tourist season in some of the most popular holiday destinations on Earth. Greece and Croatia and the wider Balkans draw many millions of summer visitors every year, and tourism is an absolutely vital pillar of their economies. So when the fires come, they threaten not just local villages, but crowded seaside resorts packed with holidaymakers. In one recent and dramatic case, a wildfire on the Greek island of Rhodes forced what became the largest wildfire evacuation in the country's entire history. Tens of thousands of people, a great many of them foreign tourists, hurriedly bussed and airlifted away from their hotels as the flames closed in on the coast. It is a jarring collision of two worlds, the carefree summer holiday and the raw, dangerous reality of a continent on fire. And beyond the immediate terror and danger, these fires and this heat can do lasting damage to the fragile tourist economies that so much of the region quietly depends upon. And there is another dimension to this eastern heat, one that reaches far, far beyond the borders of Europe itself, and which can reach all the way to dinner tables on the other side of the world. Because the great, sweeping plains of southeastern Europe, and beyond them, the vast fields of Ukraine and southern Russia, together form one of the single most important agricultural regions on the entire planet. An enormous global breadbasket that grows a staggering share of the world's wheat, its corn, and its sunflower oil. And extreme heat, combined with drought, is absolutely brutal for growing crops. When a heat dome settles in and bakes this region for weeks at a stretch, it can wither and destroy harvests across many millions of acres, sharply cutting the yields and driving up the price of basic food, and not only in the local markets, but on the great global commodity markets that the whole world depends upon. A severe and prolonged heat wave over the fields of Eastern Europe, in other words, is not merely a regional health emergency. It can quietly and steadily become a global food story, one felt in the price of bread everywhere from Africa to the Middle East. And the heat drains the East in another way too. It dries up its great rivers. Eastern and Central Europe are threaded through by mighty waterways, none more important than the Danube, one of the continent's most vital arteries, carrying cargo ships and barges through the heart of a dozen nations. But when a heat dome bakes the region and the rains fail, these rivers can fall to dramatically low levels. Barges are forced to lighten their loads or stop running altogether, snarling the transport of grain, coal, and goods along a route that whole economies depend on. The falling water has, in recent droughts, exposed strange and haunting relics from the riverbed, the wrecks of sunken warships, and even ancient hunger stones. Boulders carved by people centuries ago to mark the water levels of past catastrophic droughts, bearing grim warnings to future generations. When those old stones reappear above the surface, it is a sign that the water has fallen to depths not seen in living memory, and the heat, of course, cares nothing at all for whatever else a place may already be enduring. Spare a thought, in particular, for a country like Ukraine, which appears again and again on the grim list of nations scorched by these recurring heat waves, and which must now confront the punishing summer heat piled directly on top of the immense and ongoing hardship of a war. Extreme heat is dangerous enough in a stable, peaceful nation with reliably working power and running water. But in a place where the basic infrastructure has been badly damaged, where the electricity and the water supplies can be unreliable or cut off entirely, and where millions of people have already been driven from their homes, a severe heat wave becomes something far more dangerous still. It is a stark and sobering reminder that these heat domes never arrive into a vacuum. They descend on top of whatever struggles a place is already facing, and they very often hit the very hardest in exactly the places where people have the least protection left to give. So, is the summer of 2026 truly on track to become the single hottest that Europe has ever recorded? And here, I have to be completely and genuinely honest with you. Right now, caught in the very middle of it, absolutely no one can actually say for certain. It has beyond any shred of doubt been an utterly extraordinary and a genuinely brutal season. Beginning with that record-shattering heat wave all the way back in May, running through a deadly succession of powerful heat domes, and now this relentless fourth one, grinding its way slowly eastward as the temperature records continue to fall in its path. It is, without question, firmly on track to rank among the very hottest summers ever measured. But whether it will ultimately end up claiming the #1 spot of all is something that simply cannot be known. Not until the season has fully run its course, and the scientists have carefully gathered up and analyzed every last piece of the data, a process which usually takes right through until the autumn. So anyone out there confidently declaring it the definitive hottest summer ever right now, here in early August, is getting well ahead of the actual facts. What we absolutely can say with complete confidence is that it belongs to a very clear and a deeply undeniable pattern. Summer after summer after summer, Europe now keeps on producing heat that ranks among the most extreme in all of its recorded history. And whether or not the year 2026 specifically ends up winning that grim and unwanted title, it is unmistakably and inescapably a part of that larger trend, and that trend in turn has a very clear driver sitting behind it. Because Europe is, in cold hard fact, the fastest warming continent anywhere on planet Earth, heating up at roughly twice the global average rate. And what that means, in practice, is that every single new heat dome now builds itself upon an ever hotter starting baseline, allowing it to reach up to higher and more dangerous extremes than the very same weather pattern ever could have done just a few short decades ago. Now, the eastward drifting dome of this particular summer is not, all by itself, proof of anything in isolation. Heat waves have, after all, always happened, and they have always moved and migrated across the map. But it is the sheer, growing frequency of them, and their rising intensity, and the relentless way in which the all-time records now keep tumbling year after year after year, that together all point unmistakably in one single direction. This is simply what a rapidly warming continent looks like, in the deep, blazing height of its summer. So let me end, as I always try to, with genuine honesty and with real balance. First, on the immediate event itself, a great deal of the most extreme heat that still lies ahead in the coming days remains, for now, a forecast, and the exact peak temperatures, and precisely which regions will be hit the hardest, simply will not be known for certain until they actually arrive. So it remains genuinely wise to treat the very scariest specific numbers with a healthy measure of caution for the time being. Second, on that big hottest ever question, as I have said, that one truly cannot be settled or answered until the whole season has ended. And third, and importantly, the eastern half of Europe, for all of its undoubtedly greater vulnerability, is very far from simply standing still and doing nothing. These countries are actively building heat action plans, setting up public cooling shelters, and, most crucially of all, cooperating closely across their borders, sending their firefighters and their emergency aid to one another whenever the disasters strike, exactly as good neighbors should. The European Union coordinates a genuine, shared, continent-wide firefighting response precisely for punishing summers, just like this one. The danger is absolutely real, and the East most certainly faces it with fewer resources at its disposal than the wealthy West. But it does not, by any means, face it with no response at all. The honest bottom line is really this. The great heat wave of 2026 is doing exactly what these enormous heat domes always tend to do, baking the West first, and then sliding steadily eastward to bake all the rest, seeking out and mercilessly testing the parts of the continent least prepared to cope with it. And whether or not it ultimately finishes the season as the hottest summer ever recorded, it is unmistakably one more entry in a long and an ongoing story, one that Europe is very clearly going to keep on living and keep on having to answer for a very long time still to come. So the very next time that you find yourself watching the heat maps of a European summer, that vast, ominous blob of angry, glowing red spread across the continent, do not simply look at where it is sitting right now. Watch, instead, where it is heading next. Because these domes travel. They flatten one region, and then they drift on to the next, and the very same heat that was scorching Madrid last week may well be igniting the parched hills of Greece this week, and then pressing down mercilessly on the wide plains of Romania and Ukraine the week after that. And the summer of 2026 is following that exact same relentless path eastward, right now, even as you watch, testing, one country at a time, an entire continent that is warming faster than any other place on the face of the earth. The dome itself will eventually pass, as every single one of them always does in the end. But it is leaving behind it a kind of map of the future. One written out in evacuations and in shattered records, along with a single hard question aimed squarely at every corner of Europe, west and east alike, not whether the heat is coming, because it plainly is, but rather, how ready you will be when it finally arrives at your own door.